Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Tyler Williams. I'm an extension educator located in Lincoln, Nebraska, and focus on climate and weather. And I have the pleasure of hosting today's webinar, Climate4Cities, increasing the capacity for cities to effectively plan for climate change, with Martha Shulski, and I'll introduce her more appropriately in a second. But also, I just want to mention that we're hosting this on behalf of the North Central Climate Collaborative. NC3 is what we call it. It's a part of the North Central Regional Water Network, and every other month we have these webinars, and so it's nice for a good group of people to jump on today. Just a couple housekeeping things. I will here when we get started, I will pull up a couple poll questions. So if you see that pop-up box, go ahead and answer 2 of those, and then I'll take that away in a couple minutes if I get a good group of people to do that, and then I'll also pull up one of those at the end. If you have questions as we go along the way, go ahead and type those into the chat box or the Q&A. I'll try to watch both of those. If it's something pressing, I'll interrupt Martha and ask her that question. If not, we'll keep most of them to the end and do a Q&A session at the end. So we do record these. They're all placed on the northcentralclimate.org website, as well as previous webinars. So with that, yeah, we're happy to have Dr. Martha Shulski. You can see on the screen, she's the Nebraska State climatologist and also associate professor at UNL in the School of Natural Resources. She does a lot with things climate and weather, and the director of the Nebraska Mesonet here at UNL. And so we're happy to have her share with us a project they've been working on for some time. And as we all know, that we've had a lot of issues in communities and cities with climate related impacts. So this hits home to a lot of places, including here in Nebraska. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Martha, and I'm going to shut off my camera so people don't have to look at me.
All right, great. Thanks, Tyler. Thanks everybody for joining. We've got a great group here today. And I'm going to turn off my video for the moment so I get through my presentation here. I would like to acknowledge my co-authors on this project this was really a multidisciplinary project, and so I wanted to make sure I acknowledge them up front here. So Natalie Umflett with the High Plains Regional Climate Center, Tariq Abdul-Munam with the University of Nebraska Public Policy Center, Zhang Hong Tang with College of Architecture here at Nebraska with the Community and Regional Planning. And then we did have a person join us with the City of Lincoln, Frank Ularic. So he was a really integral part of the project. And this work was funded by NOAA and the Sectoral Applications Research Program. All right, so climate change, this is where we live in now. These are the realities of climate change. It's something that is here and that impacts all of us. It's not something that happens in a far off place and way out into the future. It's something that's happening here and now, and something that we have to deal with. It's the result of human activity. So the bad thing is it's primarily what we're doing to the environment, but for the cause, but we're also the solution. And a lot of cities are being very proactive in working on these solutions. We also know that the sooner we act, the less risky it is. The further off we wait for mitigative action in particular, then the more risk and more costly that it's going to be. And I'll just show you kind of a preview of one of the tools that I'm going to be talking about later in the webinar. And, you know, something to grab people's attention, you know, as a state climatologist, I talk to a lot of different groups within Nebraska about climate change. And one thing that really hits home with them is telling them the fact that average annual temperature, or sorry, this is summer average temperature in Lincoln, Nebraska is going to be more like northern Oklahoma 30 years from now. So just a little preview of one of the tools that I'm going to be talking about a little bit later. So those are the realities that we live in. Cities are facing increasing challenges due to the impacts of climate change. Extreme heat events are going up. There's more heavy rain events. There's more variability, particularly here in the central part of the U.S. There's shifting precipitation patterns, and all of that impacts health and facilities that are meant to deal with health in the community, whether it's cooling shelters or public health infrastructure and so forth. Water management issues and how do we deal with these increasing precipitation events interspersed with dry conditions and this variability. And what does that do to infrastructure of cities, or energy demand. When we have temperatures that are changing, that's going to shift our energy demand. So some of the key aspects in that cities in particular are impacted are in these 4 areas that are identified here. So kind of in keeping with this, these summer projections, so here we're looking at the high emission scenario, and I'll be talking about both high and low emissions. And so this assumes a business as usual approach, which means that we don't change our behavior or do anything to actively mitigate future climate change. So that's what's called the RCP 8.5. So middle of the century, you can see there's a lot of red on this map. So the number of days that the high temperature is above 90 degrees. And I'm showing an example here for Lincoln. We go from an current average of 36 days to a future average, middle of the 21st century. Just a few decades from now, that number is projected to double on average. And you can see for much of the US, that is certainly the case. And for this NC3 area, kind of the north central US, that's going to increase by 20 to 30 days, whatever your respective average that number is going to increase. So cities are facing increasing challenges. They are also leading efforts to respond to climate change. Those are words that I took from the most recent National Climate Assessment that came out in 2018. And there's a chapter that's dedicated to the urban and built environment. So we know that at the local level, in the US anyway, there are efforts that are leading the way to respond to climate change. And I've just put a few examples here, and I'm going to be focusing on kind of the Heartland region, kind of Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri. And I'm showing an example here from the Iowa City. This is their climate action and adaptation plan. So it incorporates both adaptation measures as well as mitigation measures and assessing greenhouse gases, limiting and reducing greenhouse gases. So it's a pretty extensive plan. Just one example that cities in the heartland of the US are working toward. And the other example here that I'm showing is local for me. So this is a project in downtown Lincoln that was put in place to fix a stormwater management issue as well as other issues. So there are good things going on at the community and city level to respond to climate change. And I just wanted to make mention of there's something called the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. Globally, there's over 9,000 cities that are a part of this group, which includes about 820 million people. In the US, there's 158 cities currently, when I last looked, that are part of this Global Covenant for Mayors. So you can see the US has some work to cover here. So the work that I'm going to be talking about today, it actually got started about 6 years ago. So there was a project that was led out of Iowa State University. And what happened was city planners reached out to climatologists in Lincoln, Nebraska. So that's how I became involved. In Lawrence, Kansas, Iowa City, Columbia, Missouri, and Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. So there were 5 cities that reached out and were looking to find local information, looking for trends, historical trends, as well as future projections. And if you're a user of climate information, then it can be kind of difficult to sift through everything that's available. And of course, things have changed in the last 6 years. So this was back in 2013. And so that's the genesis of this project that I'm going to be talking about today. And it was done kind of under the umbrella of this Urban Sustainability Directors Network, USDN. There was a Heartland region. And essentially, this group is a peer-to-peer learning network. So it's city planners and developers getting together and sharing success stories and learning from each other. So that was kind of the umbrella that this project started from. Okay, so this project was done, like I said, in conjunction with city representatives. And what we did, I realize there's a lot on this table here, but what we tried to do is start with where the municipal concern is. And in this example, I can kind of focus on this heavy rainfall line. So in order to determine what sort of metrics the climate folks on this project were going to look at, that was dictated by what the cities felt and saw that were a need and something that needed to be investigated, looking for trends, looking for future projections. So for example, so a way to look at heavy rainfall. So for they mentioned that stormwater management, floodplain planning, emergency response, infrastructure design. This was one aspect of heavy rain events that was of concern to the city level. And so together with the cities, we kind of came up with these metrics that we would look at to determine historical trends and then future projections as good as can be for these different metrics that were identified. So this table gives you an idea of how this process kind of developed, and again, starting on this right-hand side of the screen, starting with the municipal concern, and then determining what sort of metrics we look at for the historical information. So ultimately, the product of this project and this group of 5 cities with this group of climatologists, what was developed was Climate in the Heartland. This a pretty extensive report that is available online. You can Google search it and find this report available. This came out in 2015, and we learned some very interesting things with this project. One is that cities are seeking customized and local information. And importantly, the translation of climate data into useful information. That is really, really critical. There's lots of data that can be gathered online if you know where to get it, but translating that into information that the cities can use, like the image that I showed on the previous screen. That was something that table of information was very critically important for the cities. It was also interesting to note that challenges due to resource availability, such as funding and personnel, clearly cities, there are different local issues at play. There's people that come in and out of the city. There's elections. There's different kind of structure of the city and size and resource constraints. And so that was a consideration in this project. And also found out that, well, there's opportunities for additional work. And so the Climate4Cities, the kind of the main topic of this presentation, that was born, so to speak, in 2016. And so the group of individuals that I mentioned on that title slide, so we got together and thought, well, we can regionalize this effort and not only make it useful for those 5 cities, but let's go more broadly and look at the central region of the US. Let's assess the Climate in the Heartland product that was an outcome of the previous project. How was that utilized? How could we make it better? Let's look and dive into comprehensive plans and hazard mitigation plans, kind of the planning on the local level, and how climate information is used or not used. Let's survey cities within kind of this Heartland region and see utility of climate information, barriers to use, how to frame talking about climate change and climate planning. So that was one piece that we wanted to start with. Create what tools were necessary for kind of this broader scale effort. And then hopefully at the end evaluate how effective these tools are and what they're being used for when they're actually completed and being utilized at the city level. So it's a very broad brush perspective of this Climate4Cities project. So we started 3 years ago, and we hosted some focus groups and workshops along the way. And here are just some examples of what we heard around the region. And so the region that I'm going to be talking about kind of goes from Iowa and Missouri over to Nebraska and Kansas. So it kind of covers this nice spectrum of climate that we experience in the central part of the US. And so just some comments here from folks in the different cities. So on the top left there, how the impacts are manifested and how they're felt. So here is climate change looks different. It's drought, it's ag-based. Even if you're in a city, you're thinking about those components, which makes sense given the economics of this part of the US. Or influence on the economy. So one city said, we've had to turn away businesses because the water demand that they would be putting on our system. So a new development comes into play, and they actually have to say, you know, we can't support this because we just don't have the water availability in our area. And this is for the western part of the region, for a city in the western part. And we also heard a lot of comments that we're increasing efficiency, need to develop better interagency collaboration and entities to help each other out rather than trying to do it all on my own. A lot of cities are constrained with resources, and so things that they can learn from other cities really play a critical role in this project. Okay, so the first aspect I'm going to be talking about is the municipal survey. So we sent out 304 surveys. So that's every community of 5,000 population or greater in this 4-state region that you see in the map on the right. So 304 were sent out, 117 were returned, so with about a 38% response rate. And what I'm showing here are the dots that you see here. So the pink is metropolitans, that's greater than 50,000, micropolitans 10 to 50,000, and then smaller communities, which are 5 to 10,000. And granted, we did not focus on communities or villages that are smaller than 5,000. You could see for the Nebraska and Kansas, there's not a whole lot of dots there. So there are a significant number of communities that are smaller than that. So for this project, we did not focus on those small communities. So there's a 13-question survey that was developed. So the topics were use of climate data and information, perceived barriers to usage, status of climate-related policies, and then attitudes toward climate change. So again, 13 questions around those topics. The types of respondents were city and town managers, administrative, chief of staff, mayor. It varied. It wasn't sent to one role within the city specifically. So it varied based on the size and capacity of the city. But that gives you an idea of the types of respondents that it was. So some of the key findings with this one I think is very interesting. So the percent of municipalities that currently use little to no information for planning is 60%. 40% do on some level, and 60% little to no climate information for planning. The reasons for not incorporating this information into planning include the following two. These were the highest. I believe they were about 20-some% each. So these were the top two reasons. There was, we gave particular reasons, and these were the top two. We also gave an other category, but these were the top two reasons that were provided in the survey. So lack of awareness about the value of using such information. And the second one was lack of best known practices to integrate climate data into planning. The good thing about these barriers is that that's something that can be overcome, say with outreach and training and engagement, partnering with cities, partnering with peer cities that do have climate information incorporated into planning. So this gives us a good indication of what do we need to work on at the community and city level. How would they like this information presented to them or received? So what they said was report, webinar, or interactive online resource with localized information specific to cities. That was the #1 thing that could increase the use of climate data into planning efforts. Okay, we asked a few questions related to climate change and communication of climate change information. So the level of concern about climate change for the following 3 categories: for community members, for policymakers, and for your own personal perspective of the person filling out the survey. That was consistently higher among the metropolitans when compared to the micropolitans. So for this region, in larger cities, so areas that are 50,000 or more, there's generally a higher level of concern about climate change. The most effective ways to frame climate-related planning for support and understanding is these two items: disaster or extreme weather preparedness and a cost-benefit analysis. So we also provided answers to that particular question, as well as included in other categories, something that they could write in. But what's interesting is if we want to gain support and understanding for climate-related planning, then frame it such that it's related to disaster, extreme weather preparedness, or in terms of a cost-benefit analysis for the city. I know for myself in Nebraska, I can speak personally. We've had a large-scale and historic flood in March. The levels in the Missouri River, Nebraska City and southward have finally just last week gone below flood stage. So extreme flooding issues that we've been dealing with. And the amount of people that are reaching out about floods and about heavy rainfall and how it's connected to climate change is just through the roof this year. So I can certainly see that in terms of what people care about and what questions are they asking. So these are great ways, according to this survey, to frame climate-related planning. Okay, so that was a broad brush look at the city survey results, and we are working on a publication with that, which should be out at some point next year. Another aspect that I wanted to talk about in terms of planning, local municipal planning play a fundamental role in increasing a community's capacity toward resilience of extreme events, of impact of climate change, and so forth. And what was done, here you're seeing an image of Zhenghong Tang, who's talking about his results. And what he did was look at local comprehensive plans, hazard mitigation plans, and local emergency operating plans. So those three mechanisms of plans, and looked at how is climate change and extreme events, how is that written into and implemented in these plans. So he looked at, I believe it was 95 plans throughout the same 4 state regions, so Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, and Kansas. And he found some good aspects to it, but kind of the key takeaway in terms of something that could be improved was a lack of broad and systematic implementation of climate information into planning efforts. So on a broad scale and an integration between the different, say, departments of city or community, there was generally a lack of that in these comprehensive mitigation and emergency operating plans. So if you'd like to find more details of that, there was a paper that came out in Natural Hazards last year. So there's the title and the author in year there, if you'd like to jot that down, and you can take a look at that or send me a note and I'd be happy to send you that publication. All right, so that was kind of the research and the background that we did to this project and assessing what's going on at the city level throughout these 4 states. And so now I'm going to take you kind of a tour through what was developed. And so there was 4 different tools that were developed kind of hand in hand with the cities, as well as local reports. So there were 11 cities within the 4 state region that we worked with kind of at the table together to develop this tool and get feedback from. The website is given here, so hprcc.unl.edu/Climate4Cities is where you'll find its homepage. So one of the things that came out of surveying the cities throughout the 4-state region is we would like a localized report that we can show our mayor, that we can show our city council, that we can have a scientific basis for the decisions that we're making. So the cities that you see here, so Des Moines and Dubuque and Sioux City were the 3 in Iowa, Garden City and Hays in Kansas, Grand Island, McCook and Lincoln were the cities in Nebraska, and then Kansas City, Springfield, and St. Peters were the 3 cities in Missouri. So those were the ones that we developed reports for, and I'll show examples for that. So here is a cover and a kind of a look inside the report. So the contents of this, what did we include? Temperature and precipitation trends at the regional, statewide, and local level. So what's going on locally, given the long-term weather station that exists in my area? How does that compare to the statewide average? And then regionally, what are we experiencing with temperature and precipitation trends? We also looked at local extreme events. Extremes are certainly something that can be quite impactful when thinking about flood events, heavy precipitation events, drought events, and so forth. So kind of a look at those extremes. And then, of course, future climate projections, as well as implications based on those projections. And one thing that I think was interesting is that no matter if you were in Hays, Kansas, or in St. Peters, Missouri, the implications were quite similar. There was common threads, and the sectors that you see here, so water resources, energy, and public health, those sectors were ones that kept coming up to the top in terms of what the cities cared about and how is climate change manifesting and impacting the community level. And then finally, resources for where one would go to find more information. So these static reports are available on the Climate4Cities webpage. They're at the URL that you see. So some quotes, some things that we heard from the cities that partnered with us. So I appreciate the data, if nothing else, just to be able to have a frame of reference when they, meaning city council members, make those tough decisions. So something that is localized is quite valuable when they're discussing planning issues and where to put your efforts, especially when you're strapped for resources. You have little money and it's trying to go a long way and make the most impact. Having that, the data and the local information was really critical. So the person goes on to say, I struggle trying to figure out how to ever quantify some of these things because it's too difficult for a city our size to try to come up with a report like this. So the expertise doesn't really exist in terms of specialty and time and so forth to come up with a sort of localized report. So those 11 cities have the localized reports, but one thing that we wanted to do was try and scale this up and cover a larger region. So what you're seeing here is an outline of the Missouri Basin. So the tools that I'm going to be showing that are available online, they're available for all the states that touch the Missouri Basin. So those that you see on the image all have this information available. So there was 3 main tools and then kind of a search function for planning documents that I'll touch on. I'll just kind of show you some highlights and what somebody living in one of these cities, what sort of information can you get from this website. So in terms of the homepage, you would click on the City Data Explorer, and that would take you to this main page here. So I'll talk a little bit about the climate trends tool, as well as the climate projections, the sister city, and then finally the city plans. Okay, and again, this tool was co-developed, and we gathered feedback from these cities that worked with us. So this is a way that they told us that it would be most useful if we could do these specific things within this tool to help with their planning efforts. So looking at historic climate trends, if we just focus on the image on the left here, so this is an example, happens to be for Garden City in Kansas. We're looking at average spring temperature from 1990 to 2017. So it's showing you the 3-month average temperature trend over time. So you can see what was a warm spring, what was a cold spring, and you can toggle on and off this, you can put a trend line through it. And it may seem kind of simple, but it's really invaluable for users of climate information who are not, their specialty is not in the area of climate and data analysis. But the line that you see here, spring average temperature has increased by 1.7 degrees over this time period. So it's a really easy way somebody can look back and assess how much has temperatures or precipitation over the course of the season or the year, how has that changed over time? And there is, in fact, a clause in here. If they pick too short a time period, then it will not put a trend line in. So there needs to be, at least 10 years or more or so in order to put in this trend line. I mentioned earlier, I believe, that cities often do kind of comparators and look to other cities for how they're doing their planning efforts. So one thing that they told us would be useful is I like to compare climate in my city versus another city. And so here you can do that with this tool. So here we're looking, instead of temperature, we're looking at spring total precipitation, and we're comparing the Kansas City precip to the Lincoln precipitation. So you can compare one location to another. And 2 is the limit. You can't put any more than 2 locations on this map. Okay. Another thing that would be valuable is let's get this these climate projections for a particular location, and let's see how are our normals going to change? How are our average temperature, average precipitation for the months going to change? So here we're looking at Kearney, Nebraska. So that's kind of in south central part of Nebraska. And the green bars is monthly precipitation. And then we've got average temperature in yellow, max monthly temperature in red, and then min temperature in blue there. And the scales are the same. So it's the current normal period, so 1981 to 2010, that's our current climate normal period. And then the projected normals for 2050 to 2081. So if you want to look several decades out into the future, what is the average, say, summer high temperature? It's in the, say, mid 80s now. We're looking at closer to 100 degrees this far into the future. You can pick your, you can pick your emissions scenario if you like. You can pick lower emissions or higher emissions. So that's an option as well. And keeping in mind that the higher emissions scenario, the differences really play out middle of the century to end of the century. That's where the greatest differences are. That's where the rate of change really keeps going when you look at the high emissions scenario when compared to a lower emissions scenario. Okay. So, and then I'll show a little bit about a tool that we call the Sister City. And this is something that I showed early on in the beginning. I was looking at Lincoln's summer high temperature and what that would be like in the future. So here I'll pick on Kearney again so you can see where it is in Nebraska. So by the end of the century, if we look at a lower emissions scenario, this RCP 4.5, we're looking at this is annual average temperature, excuse me. The current normal is 49 degrees. The projected normal is about 7 degrees higher than that, which is equivalent to about mid-Kansas currently. So that's the lower emissions, and on the image on the right here, that's the higher emissions scenario. So you can see, how much further south that sister city projects to by the end of the century. So here you can see again, those differences between that lower emissions and higher emissions scenario. And the way that this sister city kind of came out or came to be in discussions with the cities, we learned that it's one thing to say, well, the average temperature will be 11 degrees warmer, but that doesn't quite put that number into perspective. But if you can say average annual temperature of Kearney will be like that of Tulsa, Oklahoma by the end of the century, then it starts to gather people's attention and put it into context. And so people will start thinking about it and caring about it and just shed the different light going from a number to an actual location. So that's kind of how this sister city tool came about. So again, there's seasonal as well as annual average, maximum, and minimum temperature, as well as precipitation. So for 4 different variables, you can look at these kind of sister city tool. And the sister city might be different, likely will be different for precipitation than it will for temperature. So it's important to note that it's respective to the certain variable that you've chosen, whether it's temperature or precipitation. Okay, and finally, another piece of feedback that we got through one of the workshops that we hosted was, in terms of planning, a lot of cities look to what other cities, maybe more kind of leading edge or progressive cities, kind of those early adopter cities that are looking at sustainability efforts or green roofs or bioswales or urban forestry, whatever aspect of the city they're looking at, the ability for cities to search planning documents that exist at other cities would be really valuable. And so what we have is basically a searchable index. So there's a number of city planning documents that are hosted and that we've searched through. So you can type in whatever or choose whatever aspect you're concerned about, and it will take you to the point in the plan that it's discussed. And so you can, if you are a city planner in Iowa City and you want to learn more about recycling efforts or whatever aspect it is, you can search through other city plans and see what's been done and utilize what would be good in your area and pick and choose what would work and what doesn't. So again, this was a function of what the cities said they wanted. All right, so the project just recently concluded, and one of the things that we're going to be doing is annually taking a look at utility of these tools, not only those localized reports, but the web tools as well, and how are they being used, and how helpful are they, and where are their gaps, if any. So we don't have a lot of information at this point since it did just end. There's been one survey that was done, and so this word cloud is showing you kind of the highest utilized words and phrases that the cities were talking about. So it's not surprising that planning comes up into it. They've got data, they're concerned about water, useful and use came up, mitigation, and so forth. So just getting a general indication as to how these are useful. There was one city that I can recall and thinking about these surveys that said what these local reports have allowed them to do is have a conversation and have a discussion about it where previously there was no discussion about it. So at the very least, it can hopefully be a talking tool and a way that is that you can discuss temperature trends, precipitation trends, what's important at the city level, in kind of in a non-biased way. So that was good to hear that at the very least they are a conversation piece. But it will be interesting to track this in the future and see specifically the utility of these tools. Okay, so just some indications as to, okay, well, how, you know, the project has ended for us folks in Nebraska, and how are we using this tool? Well, I'll focus on the image there on the left. One thing we did is conduct a public forum in Kearney. Kearney happened to experience flooding, say, not only in March, but there were some heavy rainfall events this summer. So that was actually a great place to have this discussion. So we talked about challenges that are facing rural communities and how they're adapting to extreme events. And this was co-sponsored by University of Nebraska-Kearney, and this is funded in part by the Public Policy Center. And we invited the former mayor from Greensburg, Kansas. That was a small community that was completely wiped out by an F5, a very devastating tornado. Bob Dixon is his name. It was completely wiped out years ago. And what they decided to do was develop and rebuild their community in a very sustainable way. So it was very interesting to hear from him. And we talked about the Climate4Cities project and things that we've learned from there. I've also used this for municipal water planning. So the city of Lincoln is reworking, or they're contracting with a private company to rework their master water plan. So middle of the century, will there be enough water in terms of where Lincoln currently gets our water to meet the needs and the consumptive water use of the projected population of the city of Lincoln? So we're utilizing this Climate4Cities tools to help answer those questions. And then finally, the same group that has worked on this project, we're looking at hosting, in conjunction with Nebraska Extension, hosting workshops for flooded Nebraska communities, and this idea of a local climate report for those who just experienced this very significant weather hazard, and what will these look like in the future, and how can they be better prepared. I mean, there's nothing like an extreme event to grab your attention, and so we're making use of a very bad situation and utilizing it as a teaching moment, and using this Climate4Cities tools in the process. So these are some ways that we in Nebraska have and are continuing to utilize this tool. All right, so I think I'll stop there, and so I'll leave here the website, and then my email and contact information is available there, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Tyler?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Martha. We got one in the chat box already, but if others have questions, go ahead and type those in to the chat box or the Q&A. I'm going to pull up a poll here real quick before I forget and ask you the next question, because I will forget. The first question is, this person is in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So the question is, how much different would the research data and tools be for that area?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think the methodology that we used would certainly work for that area, just in terms of engaging with the cities and the types of report that was produced and types of information. So the method, I would think, would be quite useful. It would just be the content of a report or whatever is available would be the one big difference.
Okay. Another question, are cities starting to coordinate this type of planning with other water quality improvements?
Good question. I don't know at this point. One thing that I know they're doing in Nebraska, which I can speak to more so than other states, and that is because there's multi-jurisdictional efforts going on. So Nebraska is divided into 23 natural resource districts, and they have hazard mitigation plans. And so some communities are coordinating with their local natural resource district to develop these plans. And so water would be a part of that, and water quality. So that's one way in Nebraska that I know that that's taking place.
Okay. There's another question and potentially an answer right below it, but person is in Wisconsin by Lake Superior and asked if the Duluth NOAA Weather Center can help generate a report content similar to that one. And Nancy had below had mentioned that there's a similar Wisconsin related report that can be found at Wisconsin. I think it's the Wisconsin climate change group up there, but she put the link there. So I think they're probably a pretty consistent question across most of this is where people for their area might be able to find this type of info or a type of report. I don't know if you have any guidance there.
Yeah, I would say a good place to start would be your state climate office and your state climatologist, or if your university extension program has any sort of weather and climate effort or initiative. So those would be two places to start, or regional climate center as well. There's also regional integrated sciences and assessments. There's one in the Great Lakes. So we've had a couple of questions from around the Great Lakes. So there's something called GLISA, and I can get the website and we could send that out. But those are a few resources that I would say to start with.
Okay, thanks. Another question is there generally bipartisan support of these efforts?
Well, I can speak from experience locally, is that when you have a weather event, that really prompts bipartisan support. So if you have a disaster or something that you can utilize to kind of jumpstart these efforts, then I see there being bipartisan support. It's tough to speak broad scale. That's a really good question. I think it can vary significantly locally. So mayors they change over, and there's a lot of variability and differences within mayor systems. But in giving presentations about this work, you can focus on just a preparedness and risk management aspect, and that seems to really garner bipartisan. That is really regardless of what party you're from. So I think in terms of how it's framed and how it's discussed, and using local extreme events, if there are any, as a tool to talk about it. Those are a couple of ways that I've been able to kind of cross both lines, I guess.
Okay, question here. Have you presented this information to Nebraska engineering firms doing municipal planning?
No, I have not. So I'm just thinking of the audiences that I have presented this with. They're not one of them. I happen to be giving a presentation in Kansas to a regional engineering conference in April, I believe it is. So where this will be discussed. And there's some private companies that work on hazard mitigation planning that I've talked with about this. But yeah, not a good point, not the engineering community specifically.
Okay, got a few more here. For this project, I think it's what's relating to, was it up to the cities to connect professionals on their staff to this information? I find public works professionals in my region aren't discussing climate risks, but are definitely experiencing and adapting to extreme weather. Connecting to public works associations would be helpful. So I didn't know if you know how the cities connected their professionals to this information.
Yeah, I don't, and we weren't, the project team was not involved in that aspect. You know, we didn't follow, we had one professional that we connected with from each city, and then it was left up to that person as to how best to distribute the information. So we didn't exactly follow it past that one point of contact.
Okay. Next one, is there this type of data on the ag side? Water needs change, crop selection, growing degree days, etc.
The closest thing that I can think of would be the U2U, Useful to Usable project, which does cover much of these same states here, a broad region in the central US. Ag Climate for You, if you do a Google search for that, then there's a number of different tools that are available that was developed in the same participatory kind of manner with feedback from ag producers. So that's certainly one that comes to mind here. I have had folks in the ag community ask about the climate reports that were developed here and could that be done for an ag audience, and just haven't gone that far or gotten funding for that yet. But I have had inquiries from the ag community about the Climate4Cities reports that we've developed.
Okay, got another one. Are any of the 11 cities participating in FEMA's annual National Preparedness Month every September? If so, what do they do?
Oof, well, I don't know the answer to that. The way in which we've followed up with those 11 cities is asking them a kind of a first cut at utility of the tools. So we are not following up with them in any other aspects. That would certainly be interesting to note. I would, you know, this was a very progressive group of individuals. We even had one person from the city. The city wouldn't allow her to participate on work time, and so she took personal time to participate. So I found that these folks are really active and engaged. So it wouldn't surprise me if they were, but I'm not for sure.
Okay, thanks. That's the last question I see. I did put in the chat box the website that will put the recording of this, as well as previous recordings, at the northcentralclimate.org. So I think that's all that we have today. I don't see any more questions here. So thank you, Martha. Thanks for doing this for us. And thanks everyone for joining in. Again, you can look for that recording probably in a couple days at northcentralclimate.org, as well as any upcoming webinars. So thanks again, and have a good day.